Here in Boston, city government has established a task force to study reparations for Black residents, one of many similar groups across the U.S. grappling with the lasting impacts of slavery in this country. To discuss those efforts and the many complicated questions that surround the future of civil rights and reparations, I'm joined by two local scholars of African American history working to advance the conversation. Michael Curry is president and CEO of the Mass League of Community Health Centers. He's also a member of the national board of the NAACP's directors. And Dr. Anthony Vandermeer, senior lecturer of Africana Studies at UMass Boston. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here.
Glad to be here.
I was very inspired by my colleague Callie Crossley, who earlier in the year, in a recent episode of Basic Black, lifted up the fact that we are nearly 60 years removed from the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Justice. And I think it gets lost on people sometimes that that was a demonstration to bring economic equity to Black people and civil rights to Black people. Given that those were the urgent concerns of the day then, and by many measures they still are the urgent concerns today, would you say that Black people have come a long way from that point? Have we progressed?
I'm going to the elder statesman first.
Elder statesman first.
Well, it depends on how you look at it. If you live in some of the poor communities, that answer wouldn't be a good one. Where people aren't having the proper access to health care, where they're worried about public safety, they're worried about the way the police treat them, they're worried about the educational systems, they're worried about jobs that pay them a decent wage. And then if you live in the urban cities, you got to make a certain amount of money to even rent an apartment. So on one step that you would say we have a problem, and another step you can see where there are some people who have access, and have a certain level of visibility, but that's not, all of us, and so, or at least enough of us. So we're in a really peculiar situation right now.
Michael Curry.
Yeah, it's funny. I find myself, especially since the convention's here and the lead up to the convention, people asking, aren't we a different city than we were in 1982? Are we a different city since 1950 when the convention was here? Of course we are, right? Of course we've made some progress. We need to celebrate that progress. But the reality is, as Professor Vandermeer said, if you look at all the key indicators, we have the same problems today as we had in 1950, in 1967, and in 1982 when the convention was here. Mortality, morbidity rates, incarceration rates, lack of wealth. I mean, all the issues that Tony lifted up are as prevalent today as they were then. So are we dealing with each other better in maybe an interpersonal way? Probably in Boston, even though I have stories here in Boston of people being overtly called the N-word and other things, we still have that here as well. So I think socially things have progressed. But let's get past all the social conversation. Let's talk about whether people are living as long as other neighborhoods, whether zip codes define the length of your life, whether you have access to C-suites and to medical schools and law schools. We still have that problem today.
Sarah, if I can add, because that question is a question that you have to also go deeper back into history. And at this moment, particularly with the Supreme Court decision, around affirmative action, is that we are going back to the 1800s and the 1857 in terms of the Dred Scott decision, where they said that Black people have no rights and white people are bound to respect. And so when you look at the struggles that we've had, in the progress that we thought we were making, you have to say, well, wait a minute, how much progress have we made when people are taking us back to 1857 when they're treating us if we have no rights that white people are bound to respect. They're not treating us with a sense of equity or inclusion within this so-called democracy.
Somebody said 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
That's right.
Absolutely.
One of the biggest ways I think things have shifted over time is the realm of public perception of equity and thinking about what is fair and what it's just when it comes to making living conditions equitable for Black people, the way you two have mentioned. It's been evident to me in the way we've seen people protest racism and police brutality, the ways that health inequities were lifted up when we were in the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is most evident to me, though, in the rise of local government work around reparations. Michael Curry, I wonder what factors would you say have contributed to this shift?
Well, I often say it takes time for truth to catch up to history. So the reality is truth is starting to catch up to history. To Tony's point, we now understand in this reparations conversation I always lift up Rebecca Lee Crumpler, first African-American physician, 1864, on the heels of the end of slavery. First African-American female physician. She said they seem to forget there's a cause for every ailment and it may be in their power to remove it. They seem to forget there's a cause for every community that's impacted by violence, that there's a cause for communities that are disparately poor and undereducated, that go to level 4 schools instead of level 1 schools. There's a reason behind all this history. So now the truth is catching up. The Homestead Act, the Southern Homestead Act, the GI Bill, the housing discrimination, denying us access in the labor unions. There's a wide range of history that the last 3 years forced us to stay at home, because we had to stay at home over most of that time, some of that time. We had to pay attention to things that we often don't want to pay attention to. And history was part of that. So the reparations conversation is a conversation that's long overdue about how we can walk in almost any city in this country and you can tell what people are living shorter lives, what communities are going to be poor, who's going to be more likely to be shot by the police. Once we start letting that consciousness kick in, I think the reparations conversation picks up steam.
Dr. Meer, historically, what would you say has been the biggest impediment to the reparations conversation advancing?
Well, actually, lack of organization in our community. Because reparations is a political question. It's a question that really deals with the question of self-determination for Black people to say this is what we want, and if we don't get it, there will be consequences. And so we have to be organized, the NAACP with other organizations and other networks, standing in unity, putting that demand on the table. And when we do that with unity, we're going to get what we want, because people will know that there will be political consequences. And so far, we haven't made those consequences for people to realize that you have to deal with this. It's about power. And the power is going to come through unity. And so that's been the real issue. But not only just our lack of unity, it's been the fact that this system has been creating a divide and conquer, within us, so that we don't have that unity. So we're dealing with those kind of obstacles in order to better unite ourselves and to put reparations on the table.
And if I could add,
Sure.
One thing that Tony said I think is critical. Before we ever get to that unity, it goes back to the consciousness. Because even as I sit around Black folks across this country, I travel a lot with my role on the national board, even Black folks don't understand our history, so therefore they don't understand the conversation of reparations. It's not asking for a free check, right? When you understand that there was a divide in this country that meant that your ancestors could not get the same opportunities, and therefore you don't own a home, but you could have owned a home. Or that you could have been on your 3rd or 4th business instead of thinking about doing a business. We understand that history has relegated populations to poverty and denied opportunity. Then the conversation of reparations change. So for us to get unity, we need to be on the same page about that history and not feel as if we're asking for a handout. Reparations is a model that's been used across this globe. When there's been injustice, we should be using it here.
So, this is critical consciousness. But it's a question of national consciousness. But what shapes our consciousness, in terms of the media that begins to take us into other places that we need to be. So I think you're absolutely right, is that how do we build consciousness about what's going on? This is part of the educational institution. If we're dealing with educational institutions that are basically come from the colonial outposts in terms of perpetuating those values, then we're not going to be able to raise the consciousness of people because they're being miseducated in some of these institutions.
Going off of what you're saying about educating people, I want to give us an opportunity to define what we mean when we're talking about reparations. It means different things for different people. Sandy Darity at Duke University says it's acknowledgement and redress and closure. And COBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, says it's a process of repairing, healing, and restoring people injured because of their group identity and in violation of their fundamental human rights by governments or corporations. And the UN's Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights has a similar definition, but they add it needs to be adequate, effective, prompt, and proportional to the gravity of the violations and the harm suffered. Gentlemen, how are you two defining reparations?
Well, it's interesting. So one is, I want to go to something in what you just shared of those perspectives. I often say we're a family. So all of us who come from families, and many of us come from some families with dysfunctional issues, that we come from families where there's been abuse, neglect, where children didn't get the access to the services they needed. And we know how that plays out because people aren't talking to each other anymore. Because it explodes at the kitchen table during Thanksgiving or Christmas. That's how I look at the family in this country across all races, is that we've never had that conversation about why people are broken, why people are struggling, why people have been feeling as if they need to have an apology. So that is this conversation about reparations. It's all the above. I always say jokingly, it's D, right? It's all the above. It's money, it's opportunity, it's an apology. We've never really received that from this country in the way that we should. And I think that is the conversation. Now, when we talk about dollars, whether it was Bob Johnson's trillion plus dollars, we need to get beyond studying it, because that's what, I always say that's what folks do when they don't really want to do anything, is they study it to death. We need to now start talking about policy like Evanston, Illinois did, to say, no, we're going to tie this to a revenue source, and then we're going to invest in families and individuals. Now, you may say, well, I don't want to just give out individual checks. I want to invest in healthcare institutions for access, quality, affordability, or I want to give people startup money for an entrepreneurship. We should have that as a community about what we think reparations could look like that would move us in all those indicators that we're talking about. But we haven't even gotten there yet.
I want to pause right here and say we're joined now by Dr. Joyce Hope Scott, Clinical Professor of African American and Black Diaspora Studies at Boston University. Welcome, Dr. Scott. Good to see you. And going to Dr. Vandermeer, when we're talking about crafting a policy, the way Michael Curry just mentioned, beyond a definition to remedy harm, there's a reality that folks need to decide what harm or harms need to be addressed, and then how. We're typically talking about payment, which many scholars and economists over the years have said is crucial, but we know there can be so much more to a reparations policy. In California, I think the state task force has like 12 harm areas that need to be addressed. One of the earliest promises to bolster Black people involved land. Many advocates today also talk about a need for truth-telling and institutional change. Are there any other factors you would add if you had a magic wand and you could move the partisan gridlock Congress to craft a policy? What would be in there?
Well, I appreciate the wand. No, I think that basically, and I'll go back to it, it's a question of self-determination. But it has to be democratic. It has to be rooted in the people. The people have to be involved in those kind of discussions, because we have to hear from them the damage and the harm. And it's not about a discussion, it's about the structural change in this society to make it a more democratic society. The fact that we're having this conversation proves that this is an equitable society, because reparation is about the equitable distribution of those resources. So when we look at the role that African people have played in building this society, what's the benefits? We can't even get a universal health care policy. We're worried about safety, education. We can't even get a job to pay us a decent wage to rent an apartment. So I would say that it's a question of us organizing, in a sense, independently in raising. It's wonderful what the city, the state, and the nation can say, those who have power. What about the people who don't have power? So we need mass assemblies in various communities to engage in those discussions so we can hear from the people in terms of the pain and the suffering that they're going through, and how do we repair that, how do we change that? How do we take the resources and make sure that they have adequate hospitals, that they have adequate schools, they have adequate housing. All of these are human rights. So that's part of what we have to understand when we talk about reparations, a broader conversation.
Dr. Scott, we're talking about policy areas that we think are crucial when it comes to reparations legislation. What would you have in, if you had a magic wand and you could move the gridlock Congress?
Well, I have to say, first of all, that reparations are a process and not a product. Because what was done was holistic. It was both a visible and invisible kind of harm that took place. And the affected community would need to be involved in whatever decisions are made. This is what's crucial. There are lots of ideas about what needs to happen, and I'm so pleased when I see cities and towns and states even, and countries, because I often work on the international level, some people are speaking up about it. But there has to be policies at the government level, because government was involved in setting in motion structures that dispossessed African descended people. At the state level, city level, people want to, I would hope, weigh in on righting a highly a wrong that's not only moral, but also material and epistemological, all sorts of wrongs that took place. How can we all be involved in making sure that that happens? I'm encouraged by what might happen with the HR 40 discussions, because that calls for the setting up of a commission. I'm in favor of setting up a commission to study nationally what should happen, and I believe that's the best way to do it, because it allows for many people to be involved as opposed to just a few folks. Also, what's happening at cities and town levels, like recently in Boston, there a committee that came before the city council. The city council voted to set up a committee. That kind of movement is, I believe, very encouraging, and I think that whatever we do relative to reparations, which people would want to buy in on it if they are indeed shown how they are all implicated in making something right that affects the entire country. Reparations concerns the moral fiber of this country, not just a group of people. So, yeah, and I think from government levels, cities and towns, all the way down to community activists, particularly grassroots activist groups who are involved on a day-to-day basis with what people need. So, yes, at all those levels, I think.
Let's stay with the topic of government culpability. I mean, the city of Boston, like you said, put together a task force to sort of examine what was Boston's role in the transatlantic slave trade and what is the city's role in sort of perpetuating discrimination and oppression of black people. I've heard multiple folks suggest that Boston doesn't have much culpability because the state of Massachusetts was one of the first to get rid of slavery, and I want to mention here, if nowhere else, there was so much black agency involved in doing that. The state of Massachusetts didn't just say, oh, it's time to end it. But given that, what sorts of things do you think the city of Boston would examine if Massachusetts was the first state to end slavery? So, what would you say to somebody who says we don't have anything to answer for?
So one is, even if we went to the Quaker Walker cases and the elimination of slavery in Massachusetts, even up to that point, we'd deserve reparations. But let's get beyond that, understanding the institution of slavery.
You're referencing one of the two cases.
One of the two cases that ended slavery in Massachusetts. So the other part of that is this. There's a book I love called Slavery's Capitalism. I don't know if you read that, Tony, but it talks about the fact that northern states who sort of celebrate that they ended slavery sooner benefited from the economy of slavery and their cotton mills and the clothing lines and all this stuff that was really made these northern cities, strong cities, were built off of the slavery that was happening in the southern parts of this country. So it's a crock of whatever you want to call it to think that Massachusetts doesn't have a role to play or Boston doesn't have a role to play. Again, I go back to where are black people now? And I always say to people, if you walk into a C-suite of all of our companies and you walk in, they're mostly white men, you go to our medical schools, only 5% of the doctors in this country, to my NEMA folks that are here and around the room, 5% of the doctors in this country are black. And it's been that way for a long time. You gotta say why. The why is because we've always been denied the access, the opportunity, the wealth. If you understand that, then it could be slavery, it could be the broken promises of Reconstruction. I said the Homestead Act, the Southern Homestead Act. It could be the redlining, the debt peonage of slavery. I mean, you go through all that history. In the case, I'm a lawyer. I always tell people, if you let me come into a court and argue the case for reparations, I will win that hands down every time. We're not really ready as a country to have that conversation, which is why we want to keep studying it, keep talking about it. We should actually already be calculating, not trying to figure out whether we had a role to play in it.
Dr. Vandermeer.
Yeah, we have to talk about racism and white supremacy. Because if we just talk about slavery and after the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, all that kind of stuff, right? The reality is that black people, even after that point, was not treated equitably, right? You talk about busing. Let's talk about busing. Why aren't they treated, fairly with that? Let's talk about housing. Let's talk about employment. Let's talk about how they paid some of our grandparents, less than they paid other people. Let's calculate all of that, in terms of the loss of those wages and the loss of their life in terms of a good life and so forth. So that we have to look at reparations in a broader sense, even though we're looking at it in terms of slavery, but it's looking at how we've been treated in this city. So Boston was a finance capital, of the world. And as Mike said, they were benefiting from what was happening within the slave states, even though the people were more liberal around that. But we're talking about equity. We're talking about a fair distribution of resources, that we can have a decent life. So, the question around, Boston, in this slavery early or whatever, that doesn't deal with the kind of racism, because I know folks who try to go to South Boston High School and politicians that were paying students to go in things to throw rocks at them. We need to account for that.
And I want to just give a dollar figure. So at the end of the Civil War, the value of those 4 million slaves was $3.1 to $3.6 billion. We're talking 19th century dollars, right? We're not talking Build Back Better, right?
Present day.
Present day dollars. Think about the value of their service, their work, their slavery at $3.1 to $3.6 billion. We made this country wealthy. I think it's somewhere 70% of what they produced in the South went overseas. So we can't have this conversation. I would be remiss if I didn't say this about our being comfortable with where we are and celebrating sort of the progress. There's a term Dr. Geronimus coined called weathering. Weathering, she used the term of fertility. In the 1990s, they thought that black women were having babies and having adverse outcomes because they were teens. So that's why, if we remember the 1990s, there were a lot of ads about teen pregnancy. She did a study and found out that those teen women were actually having healthier babies, and that as they entered their 20s and 30s and 40s, they were having adverse outcomes for their pregnancies because of racism, because of poverty, because of trauma. Now, the reason I raised that is she coined a phrase in 1990 called weathering, which means that the impacts of all those things have a weathering effect on our bodies. Now, bring it forward. I ask people all the time, what are you weathered to? High rates of poverty in Roxbury, which is where I grew up, in Lennox Street Housing Projects. Not being allowed access to these prestigious institutions, and we're about to even have less access after the Supreme Court case. Violence in your neighborhoods. I always say there's a social determinant of violence. There's a reason why we kill each other. There's a reason why we pick up guns. And by the way, Irish did it, Italian did it, Russians did it, Bosnians did it. It's not just black people, it's social determinants. Poverty, it's being denied access, it's being taught to hate yourself. All of this we need to unpack, and then we need to move that conversation of reparations forward.
Dr. Scott, thinking about Boston and what it could possibly be culpable for.
Boston was the first city to declare African slavery as legal. Let's not forget that. We're talking about 1640 here. There's no way that it can be exemplary from any of this. There's a port marker now at Long Wharf to indicate that Boston was one of the port cities. There are 54 port cities in this country, extending from Boston all the way to Texas, across the southern belt of points of entry where captive people were brought in. It's implicated. It was one of the places that sent out the first slave ship once the British and the North American colonies got involved in the transatlantic trafficking. Boston was the place that the ships came out of. It was the last stop on that triangle that left from Liverpool and went to West Africa, then into Barbados in the Caribbean, and then to Boston. In fact, this is how we get Phyllis Wheatley, because of the ships that came around and left off people in all of these different islands. Once they finished dropping off people at Barbados and other places, they had what they call refuse left on the ship. That ship came back to Boston. On that ship was Phyllis Wheatley. So Boston is implicated. The Puritan fathers were investors first in the Barbados trade, and then in Jamaica and other places. They were involved in, and I'm just going to say it here, in the wars against the indigenous people. Those people were trafficked into the Caribbean and exchanged for African captives. Boston was implicated in that. Boston is a great city. Listen, I'm happy. In fact, we have Belinda Sutton, who brought her case before the Massachusetts General Court and got reparations from Isaac Royale.
That's right.
For being enslaved, and a number of other cases that came forward. It is a first. It is a seminal site of activism and abolition, but let us not forget and start patting ourselves on the back. You know, I tell my students, everybody is implicit, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Everybody's guilty, nobody's innocent. You know, and the thing to do is for us, you know, to come together and laud and praise those things that have been done well, in which Boston and other cities have done well. But we cannot forget the the Boston Federal Reserve's study, where you have the assets of $8 for black families and $247,500 for white families. This is Boston.
Gaping wealth gap.
It is not a good sign.
If you're just joining us, we're broadcasting from GBH News booth at the 114th NAACP Convention in the city of Boston. I'm Saraya Wintersmith for GBH News, the exclusive public media partner for the convention. And we're talking about the future of civil rights and reparations with Michael Curry, President and CEO of the Mass League of Community Health Centers. He's also a member of the National NAACP's Board of Directors. Dr. Anthony Vandermeer, Senior Lecturer of Africana Studies at UMass Boston, and Dr. Joyce Hope Scott, Clinical Professor of African American and Black Diaspora Studies at Boston University. Over the last decade, as institutions have started to interrogate their relationship to the slave trade and the oppression of black people, we've seen monuments to Confederate soldiers come down, we've seen school and street sign names changed, we've seen other symbols undergo reevaluation. On the topic of cultural change, how important is that work?
I mean, it's so important, right? So I always say, if you went to Robert E. Lee High School and you're a brother walking around with a jacket on, or you were serving in the military and you served on a Robert E. Lee base, or as I like to point out, the ice cream song, the tune that we ran out to all the time as kids was "Nigga want a watermelon, ha ha ha." Right. Nigga want a watermelon, ha ha ha. Right? We're now having this awakening that we've been gaslighted, lied to, and the reality is we need that. You know, one other I lift up is J. Marion Sims, the father of gynecology. If you went to any medical school in this country, they would have celebrated J. Marion Sims. But we now know he experimented on Annika, Lucy, and Betsy, 3 black women without anesthesia. So how do you gain fame and wealth and opportunity in this country off the backs of and lives of black people and then not tell the truth? So this tearing down of statues and taking down names was so critical to this country because, again, it's truth catching up to history. So I celebrate that, and as much as I love the generations I come from that were bold and are stepping up, I love the younger people because they will tear down a flag. We would have had a meeting to do it. They'll tear it down. They'll walk out of a meeting at work because they don't like what you said. I love some of this boldness that's coming out of this generation because that's the only way things will change.
Some rare praise for younger folks. Dr. Vandermeer, Dr. Scott, how important is that cultural change to the reparations conversation?
It's critical. You know, symbolism is important. Image is important. I think that we need more images of people who have resisted oppression so people can see these are the values that we need to perpetuate. You know, I've traveled to Cuba very frequently, and I think many people should. One of the things that I found out was they had a black general, General Antonio Maceo, who fought the independent wars. You go to Santiago de Cuba, they have a huge statue of him in the middle of the land. You visit the cemetery, they have an image of Mary Hannah Gonzalez, who is his mother, who's considered the mother of the nation, in the cemetery by a black artist. We need to begin to put up images and statues that reflect the people locally and nationally who stood up for our human rights. It's critical.
Dr. Scott, I want to ask you a particular question because I know you are a true black diaspora scholar working across continents. You're very connected with this idea of rematriation, this concept of reclaiming ancestral remains and spirituality and culture. I think one thing that people don't often realize about the lingering impacts of slavery is that the splitting up of people from points of no return on the continent led to us having almost black cultural factions, black West Africans, black Caribbeans, black Americans, black Latinos. The rift, I think, most often spikes when we're talking about reparations eligibility and who should get benefits. But I wonder, do you think that the government has any role to play in sort of healing the divide among ethnic groups within the African diaspora? I'm being funny because in my heart I'm Pan-African, I'm rooting for everybody black, but ethnic groups within the diaspora.
Yes.
Good question.
It is a good question. Yes, I'm very pleased that you brought up the issue of rematriation because it is decidedly different from repatriation. We're not talking about the same thing. And as a result of the sort of willy-nilly capturing and enslavement of people across the African continent for in terms of the transatlantic branch, 500 years, all sorts of people were thrown together from different groups who, in fact, might have had some issues with each other from the beginning. But we went through a kind of what I would call leveling experience with the brutality of the transatlantic trafficking and the Middle Passage, and the experiences on the various plantations that people lived on. There was no better experience in Jamaica than there was in Georgia or anything of that nature. I think that what we have been taught to believe is that there was a big difference between those experiences, and somehow some people had some kind of advantage over others. When we talk about rematriation, we're talking about something that happened that violated a fundamental connection that all Africans had among themselves, regardless of their group. For example, I've been reading recently something that had not occurred to me but should have, that people who were trapped in the hull of the ships were certainly suffering, and they were concerned about their own physical brutality against them and those around them. But what they also suffered and what pained them was not being able to bury the ones that were thrown overboard, the ones that died and were summarily just dispatched as though they didn't mean anything. This kind of thing, fundamentally in Africa, even if it were an enemy, you had to give proper ritual and proper ceremony for the burial of those people. What we have in common, those of us who think we have so much difference, is the Atlantic. We have 50 million ancestors, bones in the Atlantic. We all have that in common, whether we're in Jamaica, whether we're in Suriname, whether we're in Boston, or whatever. No matter what kind of mixing we've all gone through, it doesn't matter. What about those ancestors? Shall we not, in fact, do some rematriative kinds of activities where we recognize, we get into the business of revalorizing, culture, revalorizing the epistemological framework that they came from, which allowed them to see the importance of their ancestors and the importance of being humane to each other, even in captivity, where they were with each other. There was a way that they had to behave toward each other. So I think some of the quarrel is, a lot of the quarrel is orchestrated.
That's right.
I would say that essentially. There's no hatred there's no historical reason for there to be hatred among us. I mean, people in the North American diaspora have always supported the struggles in Jamaica and the struggles in Haiti, the struggles in Grenada, and every other place where there were people. So I think that what happens is, especially after the civil rights movement, and people were able to move more freely back and forth across the Atlantic, there's some kind of ethos of disrespect or of a confusion about how we're in conflict or in some sort of hatred among each other. It's all orchestrated. Young people need to get over it, because that's essentially where it is, and their parents need to stop perpetuating these falsehoods of how they're worse or better or whatever. All of us are walking wounded orphans. We're all wounded orphans. We've all lost our mother. A very good colleague of mine in Benin said to me one time, "Listen, my sister, let me ask you a question. Suppose I tell you that there was a woman who was on her way to market, and she left 3 children at home while she's going to sell her tomatoes or sell her pineapples or whatever. And she was captured on the way there and taken to Mississippi, whatever, ultimately, where she was forced to have 5 other children. Whose mother is she? Whose mother is she? And are we going to fight over whose mother she is, or understand that we both lost our mothers? So we are in a process of healing. Rematriation means healing. It means spiritual recognition of the spiritual harm, the cultural, the historical harm, the business of losing names, of having people renamed. They were Fon, they were Tuareg, they were Ashanti, they were whatever they were, and they never were allowed to be that again. That's important. What does it mean that I'm never allowed to be Bamileke again? You know?
Dr. Vandermeer, Michael Curry, does the government have a role to play in fixing the rift among us?
Well, I would say they do have a role to play in terms of the type of policies they are making. In fact, you know, the roles they play in creating divisions. You know, I mean, we talk about, you know, COINTELPRO, you know, when you had activists who are going around trying to change society, and what they're doing, spying on them, assassinating them, locking them up, and so forth. But
Talking about the FBI's counterintelligence
program, yes, you know. But Dr. Scott's point is that we have to really look at the spiritual damage, the psychic damage that's done to black people when you aren't able to connect to, you know, certain generations of your family. You know, some of us just go back to my grandmother. Well, who exists after that? I don't know, right? You know, so that type of harm, that type of damage. So, but I think that we have to be internationalists, truly, in terms of how black people all around the world are being treated. And so for me, I don't care, you know, if you're here, you know, the question is, how did you get here? You know, and wherever you were, what role did colonialism play in that demise in terms of your destruction? So we have to address that, because we say, well, why are people coming here? Well, how are they treated where they are? You know, my father, you know, was from Suriname. He came over here on a ship. My father was deported when I was 5 years old, right? And so the question is that when you talk about how do you separate, you know, a father who was responsible with that family back to Suriname, they had Operation Wetback to get my father out of a restaurant he was working with to send him back to Suriname, right? So the question is that process I'm still healing from in terms of that damage. There are many other examples. You know, we look at the immigration policies, you know, that exist. And it's just not in South America. These are African people, Haitian people, people in Cuba. These are African people, right? So we have to not just, you know, worry about ourselves. We have to worry about the whole humanity. Because when we talk about humanity, where do we go? Where do we start? We go right back to Africa. What do they look like? And if we don't deal with that fact, we're not dealing with reality.
Michael Curry.
Yeah, so I want to start. I'm going to give a shout out to the Providence NAACP that's here. Providence came pretty deep to this convention, so I want to shout them out. You know, it's interesting. We talk about the division of our people and how intentional that is and was. I always think about a story. Around the last time the convention was here in Boston, we were dealing with a housing suit that the NAACP was bringing against the city of Boston for steering black folks away from white housing developments, Old Colony, Charlestown, name it. They were dividing the city. Now, what I love about this story is that, and there's a former senator who tells the story that when they came in to meet with the mayor, Doris Bunty was the head of Boston Housing Authority at the time, so she's a black woman, first woman elected to the state legislature. They came in to meet with her and the mayor, so she probably had to drag the mayor into the meeting. And former Louis Alisa, the senators, sit there and they present the arguments to them about how this was discrimination and why they're bringing a legal case. The story goes that the mayor listened to the story, turned his chair, and he didn't pay attention to them until it was over, and he turned his chair and he said, "You get your black people, I'll get my black people, and we'll see who wins." Oh. This has always been the strategy, right? Is to divide us so that we don't keep our eyes on the prize, so that we're not aligned and together on what the objective is. It's a strategy that will always be there, but you know, I almost say government's role in that, I'd like them to stop doing that, but we got to stop letting them do that. So that means we got to be in conversation. I don't have to like you, but I can still work with you and figure out what's in your best interest and mine. I just think Boston is a great microcosm of black diaspora. The Caribbean community here is strong.
Very.
We have a large Cape Verdean population here. My mother came here for the warmth of other suns, right? Isabel Wilkerson's book. She came here from Alabama. How do we now bring all that family together and say, you know what? You're dealing with the stops and frisks too, right? Let me bring you together that your children aren't able to get that C-suite role either. How do we now make that case so that we all can come together? I don't think that's about government. I think that's about us.
I'm glad you're mentioning the Rhode Island chapter of the NAACP, or branch, not chapter. I want to start this question with you. What role should legacy civil rights organizations be playing now that we have so much momentum around reparations?
Well, one is we've had a series of reparations resolutions. I chair the board's African Policy Committee. That means that a lot of the policy that comes to this organization comes to my committee. I have phenomenal leaders around that table who lead housing, education, healthcare, environmental justice, and so many other areas. We take up these policy issues. So we've had a long history of reparations bills. So I think our goal is to still raise the consciousness of our communities. Our branches are supposed to go back with those resolutions, those whereas clauses, those therefore be it resolved clauses, and then operationalize them in the ground and in cities and towns. We should be modeling what Evanston did. We should be looking at what other cities have done to take reparations seriously. And then I think the role of legacy civil rights organizations is we should be putting pressure. Now, we're nonpartisan, but I say this, when black folks show up, they'll vote the way we need them to vote. So we got to turn them out so that they can vote for these policies. Sheila Jackson Lee's bill that she inherited is one that we should be talking about more, making the case for more.
You're talking about HR 40.
HR 40, and then we should be looking at local versions of that. So I think the NAACP is in that mix. Urban League, I'm sure, is in that mix. NAN is in that mix. There's a lot of us. We need to now start to do that together.
Dr. Scott, Dr. Vandermeer, don't indict the NAACP, but what should our legacy organizations be doing?
Well, I applaud what the NAACP has done over the years. Their focus has been spot on because they've gone at it from the legal perspective. It was laws and the orchestration of laws, positivist laws that put people into certain categories and racialized opportunities, etc. And the NAACP rightly went right after that and exploded those unfair blocks against black advancement, and they should continue to do that. The NAACP, CORE, and all of these legacy organizations have been responsible for a lot of changes that have taken place, and they should continue that. I think also that, and this is from my perspective,
Sure.
as I've said earlier already, reparations, restorative justice, restitution, this is a global issue. It is not something that only Boston is dealing with. It's not something that just the United States is dealing with. There is a mass movement around the globe around restorative justice, around civil and human rights and so on. And we in this country are not apart from it. So organizations, legacy organizations, have always worked in a Pan-Africanist perspective. They can lead us in this because they already have the groundwork. They know how to do that. They know how to build the bridges. They built the bridges, and this current movements and other kinds of issues should be able to move across the national lines in terms of what we want resolved, as well as international, based on the good work that they've done. So they should continue with what they're doing, just do it more and do it more effectively, and most importantly, reach out to the young people.
Dr. Vandermeer, if you're a regular person not affiliated with any legacy institution, what should you be doing to kind of seize this momentum around reparations?
Well, we have to build a broader united front. I think that we have to work with other local organizations on the ground, create those relationships, because it's not one entity that can really create the conditions that we need in order to move forward. So that we have to go a lot deeper, and particularly those who are most disenfranchised, to help build organization and networks. So we have to go a lot deeper than we've been going, because when you look at the fact that the Supreme Court decision, around affirmative action, it shows some weaknesses on our part in terms of us leaning and pushing, going back to Barack Obama, and looking at, how is it that we lost the ability to get Supreme Court justices elected. So we got to go deeper, and so we got
the stalling of Merrick Garland as a nominee to the Supreme Court.
Right. So we have to, go much deeper. I think we got to push the envelope a little further and press the button a little deeper.
And now this last question for all of you: intergenerational collaboration, I think, is crucial to moving any work forward. I always like to know what seasoned folks think younger folks should be doing to help advance the work. What advice are you giving to younger people?
So I want to lift up, while we're here in Boston for the National NAACP Convention, 2017, I went to the National NAACP with the DC president, Akoshua Ali, who's here, the Dallas president at that time, Aubrey Hooper, who's here, And we said we needed to train the next generation of civil rights leaders. At that time, Cornell Brooks, who was the CEO, the board agreed. We now have trained 400 21 to 45-year-olds, some of what they would get in Tony's or the professor's class, where they basically had a year to learn about our history, about the issues around reparations, around how to mobilize people, all these technical, how to deal with the media, and they've graduated from this course. So I think that the movement, I'd love to have us trip into the next John Lewis, or the next Dr. King, or Diane Nash, or name the other civil rights activists. We can't afford to do that. We got to train them to do that. We got to prepare them to do that. NAACP deserves credit. You'll see them walking around with Next Gen on their shirt throughout the weekend. These are some bad brothers and sisters. They're running for elected office. They're going back and taking over branches and becoming branch presidents and secretaries and treasurers. That's the real work of the NAACP, that intergenerational work. I am proud of the fact that these people will be the next CEOs of our organization, the next board members who take my place as well.
Dr. Vandermeer, 30 seconds. What should young people be doing?
Well, they should be studying and they should be engaged in activism. They're the ones, in fact, when you look at Black Lives Matter, the uprising of young people, they have to continue that, but they have to develop deeper organizations, develop relationship with other organizations, older organizations, some of the elders, so they won't make the same mistakes that we made, but they have to press the envelope and they have to keep their values before them, because what this system does is it will co-opt you. And so we got to be able to create a basis for us to stay on the one.
Dr. Scott, ladies' last word.
I'd like to sort of ditto what my brother just said. We have to, in fact, work with young people, to teach them about the strategies of activism that have worked in the past, and to put that in perspective with what they're trying to do today. I work with young people every day. I have a great deal of faith in them and their ability. They are charged, ready to go somewhere, but they still need the guidance. I think that we, this generation, maybe we've stepped back too far, too fast. We need to step up again, invite them in and give them some scripts, in other words, some possibilities. Here is what worked, where are you, here is what we did that worked, and maybe you see some other things that might work better. But there is no divide, there should be no divide, no complete break between those former activists and young people. It should be a continual link. This is what allowed us to progress to where we are today. There was never separation between the young and the old and the older people when we were in captivity, and it shouldn't be now, especially because young people have so much to offer. They're so well versed in the technology and the other ideas. They have such brilliant ideas, and they would look forward, in many instances, I believe, to organizations like the NAACP, like professors and others, media people who can show them this is the way you might want to think about programming your life. So we have some sort of unified work to do with them, because they're absolutely the future.
We'll have to leave it there with an intergenerational call for work. Michael Curry, Dr. Vandermeer, Dr. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Saraya Wintersmith for GBH News.